everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on the time of the day that you're watching or listening.
Yep.
That's right.
We're
Those are the
here
three
with
options.
3 options that we know of. And then we have Pastor Bruce over here.
I am here, Pastor Eric Gill.
Yes, I'm
It's
here.
Beyond the Pew.
Beyond the Pew.
Yep. And
Yep.
we have a guest, a special guest.
Special
Another
guest.
one. Crazy.
Another special guest, normally behind the camera.
Behind
Yes.
Behind the camera.
That
Not
could
beyond
be-
the pew, but behind
that
the
could
camera.
be another
You could put my
podcast
camera
name.
behind the pew.
Yeah.
And then
Behind the camera.
We'll beyond, yep.
You notice
That's
how
it.
we don't get we don't have enough special guests. Like there's always a new special guest.
But, yep.
We don't get enough as in they just keep coming.
They just keep
Yeah, we keep bringing you
Yes,
special
they just
guests.
keep coming with special
And
guests.
today is none other than the world-renowned
Yep.
MC Morales.
Look at that.
But what is your real name and who? I guess introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is not MC Morales, though you can totally call me that if you like. Miles Quibido. I am the video director at Maranatha Bible Church. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So just for context, spell your last name.
Yes.
For context.
It's a lot. Quebedeaux. So
And then from
yeah.
that, we arrived that it's easier to just call him Miles Morales.
sure, why not? Yeah, absolutely. But as far as being video director, I think that was almost why you stopped. You were waiting for me to talk about it more. So along with Adam Littlefield, I do support in general production across Maranatha Bible Church. But on top of that, too, just being more video specific, managing broadcast and general video production, including things like this podcast and other ways of supporting ministry heads that are involved in the ministries we do here at Maranatha. So whether it be through video production for just general promotion of events or testimonial content, we even have baptism that we just at this point kind of completed. And so most of those videos and interviews, we do those as well. So yeah.
It's pretty extensive work that you do.
Sure. Yeah. Which is almost why I get a little rambly because it's just like if you think that's maybe a thing that a video director does, it's probably close to what I've done.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Miles, how long have you been serving at the church? Because you're a relatively new position.
Yeah. So depending on kind of when this one airs, it'll be just over the 2-month hump. So I started August 14th. So that's when that would have been. So yeah. So pretty fresh, like you made the point of. Sure.
Yeah.
That's
The
great.
newest staff member at Maranatha up to this point.
Yeah, that's right.
So, which we were very excited. Now, you have a very unique role, and I feel like depending on your church background,
Sure.
depending on even in your age, I guess, people may have different opinions as to what is that you do, but also why is that you do those things. So the question is, why is production such a crucial aspect of the modern church?
Yeah, I mean, when you phrase it like that in a way where it's specifically relating to modern church.
Yeah. Modern, not in the sense of like today's church.
Yeah, I understand. So my whole thing, like first and foremost, when you talk about background, I started working in ministry as a student pastor. So naturally, a lot of my bent is to try and create and help facilitate engaging environments for all 5 generations of the church. And at Maranatha, I think that we do have very prominently all 5 generations participating in worship and in the teaching that takes place. And so when I think about production as it relates to the church of today, or just at least a foot forward version of the church of today, it is a matter of like creating an environment that does exactly that, to where no one on either side of the spectrum of the generational gaps feel like they're not being thought of or accounted for when that takes place. So why production is important, our production director, Adam Littlefield, has I'm going to get it wrong, but he has a card posted on his corkboard in his office that talks about creating non-distracting and engaging environments of worship. I'm probably wrong in quoting that, but I think the heartbeat behind that would be the same thing that I would hope to achieve as it relates to video or any other supporting item when it comes to production, is that the goal isn't to have a cool and flashy production that we put on. The goal is to create a non-distracting and engaging environment of worship, whether it relates to the music portions of that or the teaching or anything else that we hope to put on a pedestal to represent in the course of a service or otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah. And production a lot of times gets the negative connotation.
Sure, yeah.
That it's because it's a show, or it's
Yeah.
because you're trying to perform. But we have to understand that there's an aspect of production in the standpoint of creating an environment where distraction is removed, as you mentioned.
Totally.
And in addition to that, though, also taking advantage of it in regards to production as tools to get the message out and to be able to further the ministry that is already present.
Right.
So more people can see it and more people can engage with it. And so one of the ways we do that right now, we live stream every Sunday.
Yeah.
And even putting the time and effort into making what's happening in the church available to those maybe that aren't in the church yet, or that for some reason can't be at the church yet. And so production's huge when it comes to that. And we've been blessed. We've been fortunate to hear a lot of testimonies from people of how that's ministered to them.
Great.
And you play a huge role in that right now,
Sure.
obviously. And so we're always seeking to improve in that too. So.
Yeah.
And you were alluding to where we're going next, Miles, because to your point, Bruce, I feel like when, depending on your background, when you hear the word production, you immediately assume that we're talking about a show.
Sure.
Like you go to a Broadway event or you go to a play or a concert, you think of the production as like, oh, I'm going to that thing to be entertained or to be just surprised or engaged, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, with that, there's also the recognition that, you know, as times change, not everything, but there are areas that it will be beneficial for us as a church to innovate. So in your experience, what would you say are some ways that we can innovate in our production without becoming that a show where people just come in to be entertained?
Yeah, I mean, I want to answer initially almost as like a non-answer because I think that innovation and production are always, assuming that we're always on the path of being interested in getting better at what we do, they're always going to be hand in hand. I think that the difference between what you're saying when it comes to innovation and the difference of like being a show, that's entirely a posture thing. The trouble is that, you know, we live in a world of strong presumptions. Like people look through the lens of what people want them to see all the time. If you go to someone's personal like social media account, or even they have a website or whatever, they have an about me section where they might tell you what they think of themselves and they want you to see about them. But when church happens, a lot of times people bring their assumptions about what church is before they even give it a chance. And so they can walk into a worship center or a sanctuary or an auditorium, whatever they call it, and they can take all the baggage they have about what church is in as they go to see a production of sorts. And so some of that is on us to constantly show the character of what we're hoping to accomplish in a worship context. If you're always trying to elevate production and care about it, the frustrating part is that sometimes people's assumptions about what you care about are going to be that, unless you have a pastor, a worship pastor, or anybody that's leading worship that directs people back to the most important parts.
Yeah, sure.
But what I would say too is that this isn't an issue that the church has had only most recently. When you look at like the history of when stained glass windows were being first brought into like the early church, there was a lot of apprehension about that. But the truth is like all that does is frame up the things they care about the most in a beautiful way. To people that didn't necessarily see the value in it, there was a little bit of, why do we need this? Is this necessary? Is this all those things? But we look at it now as a revered part of history and a piece of art that represents the things that we honestly care about the most. And so like when I think about those things and I think about, is it a performance? Is it all those things? A thought that comes to mind is like, if you go into someone's house and if they have a family, and especially if they lived in that house for a long time, have you ever walked into their home and seen frames put on their walls that only still had the like insert that they had when they bought the frame? You don't. And especially when you think about, you gentlemen have been to seminary and you've worked through education, and you, I would imagine, have your diplomas and things framed. And the odd part of it too is that like if you cared about it and it was a mark of like accomplishment, you frame that too. And so whether it's our families, whether it's our accomplishments, whether it's our testimony, whether it's our faith, we do put a frame a little bit around the things we care about. Production serves, I believe, in a week to week or biweekly or whenever it gets utilized, I feel like it is just a metaphor of a frame around what we care about. We don't necessarily care about the frame. You know, when we invite people over to our house, we don't necessarily show them our frames that we have of our pictures, but we use that frame to show what we care about the most. And so in light of that, production and saying, how do we prevent from putting on a show which is your question, is just to remind them of what the thing is that we're using production to showcase for. Production is not the goal. The goal was leading people to Jesus in a new and engaging way. So,
And, you know, we had Stephen Poindexter on in the past, and he's, you know, focused on a lot of the administrative side of things in our office. He's our office manager and focuses on that. And he talked about the necessity of planning and the necessity of having organization and administration as something that is an enhancement. And so in many ways, production and all that goes into production shows how much we value and care about what it is we're seeking to accomplish, because it would be much easier to just say, you know what, we're not doing any of that. We're just going to stand up front and do what we're going to do, and whatever happens, happens. Yeah. And there are some people who are like, yeah, that's what God uses. But at the same time, when you look at the building of the temple, for example, when you look at, you know, those things that people would do in honoring God and giving God the best with what they had available to them, it mattered to them about those things. And so what you're saying is really, I love the picture that you're giving of the framing of what is supposed to be, of what is supposed to be focused on. And in many ways, that's what production's doing, is it's framing it up for people.
And when you think about it, like, and it is kind of crazy. So like when you think about the building of the tabernacle, and all of the nuances that went into it, and how very rigid things were. And at times, like when you look at the cost for production, like if we want to just use those words, because we use them regularly now, but the cost for production that it took to properly erect the tabernacle, that was an intentional and costly process. But they cared about it, and they did it. So,
And you wouldn't want that, but there may be someone could have been someone who would look at that and feel like, while we're doing all this seems too extra for what we're doing. Like, we could simplify this and still honor God, which in a sense you could, but it is very interesting that even in that moment, like, God was very specific about what he was requiring them to do.
Yeah. The other thing too is that, like, on the comment of, because that's a whole nother topic, right? Is like, could we do the same with less? I think if people got to know me more, I think they would realize that I'm not a maximalist. I don't want necessarily things just for things' sake. And judging by a lot of the conversations that, you know, Adam, our production director, and I have had about these things, we very much are interested in, not to be lazy, don't misunderstand, but it is a matter of what can we get the most amount of return on for the least amount of investment fiscally. Because we do realize that with the roles that we have, and especially, you know, you guys in similar ways, but for different reasons, we recognize the faith that each person that attends this church is putting into us, as far as like what we're going to do with the tithe and the intention that they have put forward on it. And so because of that, that's why a lot of the choices that we make and a lot of the things that we dive our time into is prayerfully considered and thought through. And so when you ask the question, you know, do other people think about, is it necessary? Is it extra? Is it, you know, absolutely. I agree. And so I would love, you know, obviously to continue answering that question on a day-to-day basis to make sure we're not doing anything over and above what's necessary to tell the story of what God's doing. Yeah.
Which alludes to the next question. You know, as someone who I would say you're an expert of recording, because you
expert loose, but
I wouldn't say loosely. I would say he's being humble, but he's really good at recording or using the camera. But what are the advantages of storytelling? So you're really good at capturing that. So what are the advantages of storytelling, and how does it relate to both the church and the daily life of a believer?
Yeah. In some way, shape, or form, I think that whether it's storytelling in the form of film or even photography or whatever the visual medium might be, I think that we're all required in some capacity to tell a story of what God's doing in our lives. And I think that people kind of miss that the explanation of what God has done in my life and what he continues to do is a testimony that is ultimately used to further the Great Commission. And I think that while it is an Old Testament story, in Joshua, when Joshua has the 12 tribes of Judah crossing the Jordan, the thing is that he tells each member of that tribe to bring a stone and to erect it in the Jordan and use this as a monument to remind yourselves of what God has done on this day, and to then go and tell the future generations to come what God has done on this day for the sake of the legacy of God. And, when we look at the Old Testament, we have to be very careful about what is prescriptive and what's descriptive, not knowing that, Joshua and God himself was not talking directly to me, but I'm looking at this to know that the character of God, we learn that God is a God that wants to be known and be made known.
Sure.
And through understanding that Joshua mandated that to tell, like the oral events of what had taken place, it's important. And I think that video particularly gives us a means to tell a story in a much more engaging way at times than we could ever do with people on a large scale in any other capacity. And so as it relates to the church, as it relates to day to day, I think it's important that we regularly think of how can I best use my testimony to let people know what God is doing in my life. I think that's practical and necessary in general. But as it relates to video, I think that one of the coolest things that the church has an opportunity to do today is that now, maybe more than ever, is short form video and long form video more accessible to create than it ever has been, but it also is more digested than it ever has been. So whether it be social media related, whether it be in-service content use, website based, or some level of ad based use, which I don't know that we would get it on storytelling at its face, but for event promotion, I think that we are at a point now where if the church doesn't at large recognize that this is a possibility that we can capitalize on, then we're missing a great opportunity. And that comes with two people. That's one, the church recognizing that it is a viable option to do. And then two, the person that you would hope to have a story and see the mandate or the calling to show what God is doing in their lives, to also value it equally. And so me as video director at Maranatha, it's absolutely exciting to be a part of a church that is faithful and interested enough in that process that they would care enough to kind of go down that road and ask questions like this.
Yeah, in many ways, where the production team and video that's being distributed, that's being recorded, whether it's testimonies, baptism testimonies, individual videos that have been shown in services or that are posted on social media, in many ways, we're putting tools in people's hands,
right?
From the church to be able to utilize, to be able to share, and to be able to impact people who, as we mentioned earlier, may never step foot in the church initially, but that's a way that we, can still share what God's doing and hit audiences of people that we otherwise would never hit. And right now, given the current culture we live in, those are endless possibilities as far as online presence and how we can minister to people even through media. And we want to, as much as possible, take advantage of that.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, we had, when we had John too, he talked about the value of engaging in social media and engaging with the content that we produce. And majority of the content that comes out from our social media page comes from things that you're doing right now, whether it's photo or videos. And the value of us as a church to be able to kind of empower individuals is to say, hey, look at this little short clip from a sermon on a Sunday. You may not think that that's important, but by you sharing it, you don't know if that is something that God can use to speak to the life of somebody. Or this video of a testimony of somebody that just got baptized and how God works in their life. Or, when we share something about, we had Kristen as well, about, the ministry that we have for
Grace and
Beauty,
Yeah.
You just don't know the reach of what those things can do in someone's life, and I think that Poindexter also had a good way of putting it. It's today, where in today's world, I'm naming them all. He said people come through the church first. Or as people come through, it used to be where people walk to the church first, but now they check us on an online platform, and a lot of you doing comes out into that venue.
Yeah. The other thing too, that, and this is a one-off thing. If you guys are familiar with Maranatha Bible Church, you guys might know the great Rick Kaleli, who's our director of our maintenance. He and I were talking about it the other day. The things that you just mentioned, just to kind of circle on that. I think that's great, equipping people with a resource that can then be used to kind of shuttle the gospel message to other people is fantastic. And then to your point, also it gives people resource to be aware of ministries that are also there. The thing that Rick and I were talking about the other day, is that it just seems like the deeper, what he said, that the farther and farther we get away from his generation, the more and more interested people are in authentic stories of what God is doing. And so I feel like more so, if I think about my life, right? Like I grew up in a home that had a strong biblical basis, but very rarely, ironically, did I have personal testimony of what God was doing being told. So it was like lots of biblical education, lots of principles, lots of, you could say, rules put around me around what it should look like. But very rarely was I being told about what God is doing in the individual lives of the people I was around. And so the trouble can be, especially as you like look at my generation and below, so like the 30 millennials type vibe and below.
Not you, Bruce. Not you.
It's debatable. It depends on who you
It's true.
read.
It depends. Yeah.
No,
Whatever
we
study
know.
takes.
We know.
But as we kind of like drift farther down in the number count, which I didn't even mean to mention a generation, but I'm sorry, Bruce. But anyway,
fine, yeah.
But as we
Whatever.
drift farther down, there seems to be less of an interest in the rules and more in the testimony. And that's not to say that people don't necessarily carry, once they profess a faith in Jesus, that they aren't interested in caring about how to live a life of sanctification and holiness. It just means that the more interested we are in knowing the humanity of the people that are a part of the church that we're a part of. And so you want to talk about like how the gospel in practice can like cause life change is when people are legitimate about what God has done in their life and where they came from and where they're at and how people can better understand Jesus on the level that they did too. And the only way you do that is by people being willing. Talking about, the Joshua passage again, is like it took effort. And one of the things that's a huge bummer about that is that in 2 Kings, it actually talks about that group that was supposed to talk about the things that God did on that day, further his name into generations. And it says there that generation couldn't have been farther from God. Yeah. And so my fear also would be, it's just like that we don't see opportunities to tell the true story of what God's doing. And it really, even if we made 100 videos that didn't exactly on the nose give opportunity to show what God's doing, but we promoted an event. Yeah. Man, that would be a bummer. So yeah, no, you're exactly right. But the videos, when used appropriately to be a vessel for the gospel message, I think it is extremely strong. Yeah.
So with your skills, you're constantly capturing stories.
Sure.
And I know you do things on the side, like you do weddings and things like that, and you're constantly looking at different set of stories. So when you think about the greatest story ever told, which is not like a mystical story, it's more like it's like an actual event that took place, And I say that because sometimes you hear the word story and you think it's like, okay, a children's thing. No, we're talking about an event that happened.
Far away, there was,
we're not talking about that. Yeah. We're talking about the gospel, who Jesus is and what he did for us. And so I think that there are principles on how to tell that story. But my question is, as someone that is constantly capturing storytelling, what are some principles or things that we should or that you look for when someone is sharing a story that they should prioritize when we are telling the gospel, sharing the gospel with other people?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a discerning thing is that there's always 3 major parts. And I don't think this is even necessarily strict with stories themselves, but it's always conflict, pinnacle of conflict and solution. It's just I think that we all began in a position of being fallen. We all began in a position of also believing that that this is it. There isn't necessarily a better life to be lived. There isn't a life abundant beyond the one that I have. And then what does C.S. Lewis say? He says God whispers in our day-to-day, shouts in our pain. I forget exactly how it's
something similar.
Something to that angle, but I believe so much that that is true, is that God uses areas in our life to make himself more presently acknowledgeable. It's not to say he wasn't there before. Yeah. It's just to say that we go so long in our lives having him there, having him available, but we in our depravity and our fallenness don't have the awareness to know that he's there the way he is. Yeah. And in those moments, we have a pinnacle of the problem. And that in and of itself, it gives us a crossroads and understanding that there is a grace, there is something out there that we don't deserve, but yet was given to us regardless. And because of that, we have a life to live that is abundant, not necessarily problem free,
Mhm.
not necessarily overly like 10 out of 10 joyous every single day that has no issues whatsoever, but one that is abundant, is mission filled, and it has a purpose.
Mhm.
Inside of that, all of us have that. If we profess Jesus as our Savior, we truly understand the depths of where we were prior to understanding and knowing Him. We can articulate that.
Mhm.
I think that's where, when I say knowing how to tell your own story, is to ask yourself more clearly, how do I personally explain that? How do I personally describe that for myself? And I think everyone has a unique way of telling not only their story, but the story of what God has done. I think that's a crucial part too. It's not just your story to hold on to, it's His story to be told, you know? And so because of that, it's an incumbent upon us to know how to say it, because that is our testimony. And the way in which we can explain that, it's just another tool. It's another bullet in the chamber just to fire at the enemy with. And the moment that you're convinced that your story isn't a special one, that's not true. Sure. And the moment that you're convinced that, that there isn't someone that would appeal to it or understand it, that's also not true, because for every one of you, there probably is 100 of you also that feel that same way, but if could be just encouraged to think of this differently. I think the church needs it. I think God deserves it for what He has done for us. But yeah, so like every single person has an independent redemption story that is extremely valuable. And it bums me out sometimes when people don't believe that it's real and that it's worth combing through and sharing.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes we don't hear some of the testimonies that flow from the testimonies that have been recorded.
Yes.
Right? So we recently had our elders share their testimonies on Sunday morning, and we heard a lot of feedback almost from every week where someone in the congregation related to either the past struggles or history or whatever that our elders shared about their personal lives. And they were just really encouraged, thinking, wow, like I thought I was the only one that dealt with this, or I thought I was the only one that struggled with this. And so people don't oftentimes realize what God has done in their life and how God has transformed, no matter how quote unquote dark or deep your past goes. Yeah. Anybody who's been transformed by Christ, it's a miraculous work of God. Yeah. And that should be shared, but we don't know the scope of how much impact that can have, right? And part of it is I think people need to be willing to share how they've been impacted. And that inspires other people then to impact people.
And I think that like you think like we in our history, I remember multiple baptisms like that either I've heard being recorded, or that even on that day when we were doing it as testimonies being shared, that they said in their testimony, so I was here at the last baptism and I saw this someone's testimonies that they share, and how the testimony impacted me so much so that I realized, okay, this is something that I need to do. And to me, like it's funny, I just had this conversation with somebody about the value of our testimony, and how often we think that if the more dramatic or the more dark your testimony is, the more powerful it is. And to your point, Bruce, it's like, no, every single testimony is powerful. It's worth it to be shared, because it's talking about how someone who was dead in their sin is now brought to life. And that's worthy to be shared. And so for us, as we're doing this podcast, that we're encouraging our people or our listeners to take whatever we're learning on Sunday and apply it beyond the pew, this is certainly an area that we can all apply. It's to recognize that we have a story to tell, that truly it's not our story. Yeah. It's the story of how God worked in us, and we are just blessed to be the ones to get to tell it. Yeah. And so to encourage our people, or you listeners, or whoever's watching, that there's something that you can do too, that if you're a follower of Jesus, you have a story to tell. And so let's share it.
Yeah. And I mean, we could probably ramble about this for a long time. The other misconception too is that your testimony is only the moment of, committing your life to Christ. Yeah. Sure. But what I can say confidently is that while that portion of my life isn't especially glamorous, there is other parts that I feel like my wife and I, especially with some of the life that we've lived together since, that we definitely feel like a bigger part of our testimony is what God's been doing in the last 5 years, but not necessarily, not that it wasn't worth talking about or isn't consistently, but I feel like there's a lot of weight on acknowledging what God does in the present just as much as what he's done in the past. And so the testimony of a person is not just one day, one time, and we're done. We've arrived. It is a matter of the fact that we have a living God and we have a living faith. And in light of that, we live a life still on this earth presently. And because of that, there's always more to talk about. And there's, like I said, I could riff on that for probably more than necessary. But it is something that, to your point, is valuable just to remember that for as much as you wake up each day, pray a prayer of protection over yourself and your family. There is equally as many people out there that need the grace that you have, and you have a story that is worth talking about. Yeah,
and I love that because it's a reminder too of like, we serve a living God that is constantly acting, that is constantly working. And the same way he worked when we first believed, he's still working today in our life. And so it's one of the beauties of the gospel is that our testimony, in a sense, is never ending.
Right.
Because so long as you live, God's still working in your life.
That's right.
And so long as you live, there are things about your life that you can still share and be of a blessing for somebody that is listening.
Yeah.
So Miles, with that, as someone who is involved, I think we were talking, just in the month of October, you have made like 20 videos or a little bit, something like that. How would you encourage our congregation? So if someone is listening or watching that attends Maranatha, what would be your encouragement to them as to how they should respond to that content? Whether it's something like this podcast or, a testimony video that we share on social media, like what would be your encouragement for us to deal with that?
Yeah, I think engage with it, celebrate it. It ultimately, what is it? How's the phrase go? It's just like we participate in what we celebrate. I like that. It's an interesting thing how people will get involved at a basketball game. People will do tons of things around what they want to do. Even this month, a couple movies have come up, and I've tried to arrange ways for going to see the first couple showings with friends, and we'll engage over text, and we'll do all these things and these forms of communication and collaboration to get to it. But when it comes to just the church and the things that we put together for it, it's surprising sometimes how we have a different gear, a low gear we take with it. And I'm not saying this to try and make anybody feel bad, but it is one of those things that when you hear testimonies of people that or people that you resonate with, sharing that stuff, not for the sake of just being a good Christian and sharing it, but asking yourself legitimately, am I moved by this? Is what the church is presently doing, does it excite me? Knowing that we're citizens of heaven, residently on earth, are my behaviors reflective of a person that is interested in what's going on? And as it relates to like this podcast, I think that one of the things I shared with both of you guys when we first kind of kicked it back up was that if we value this, we need to try and, put it in front of people in a way that gives them an opportunity to engage, but also just kind of like realistically take the feedback in of how are we, how is it being listened to? What is our, just looking at the metrics realistically. But I think that it's important for anyone listening to know that we don't put time and effort into things that we don't believe is valuable for you as a listener to take part in. And so encouraging one another through these tools that we create is especially valuable to me, and I know it is to you guys too. But I know that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but just engage with it in whatever way that is. Share it with people, comment on it, do the things that show that you're a part of the community you want to be a part of.
No, absolutely. I like what you said. You participate in what you celebrate. And the hope will be that as things are coming out, whether it's a sermon or a testimony or an invitation to an event that could be instrumental to somebody, that as a church, we're celebrating that. So much so that we're willing to share it so that it will multiply into other people's life. Now, Miles, as somebody who, has been here for quite a long time, and you have said behind the camera pretty much, there is a question we ask at the end of every single almost a testimony. I
Yeah,
think
at the end
episode.
of every testimony.
Miles, so at the end of every podcast,
There you go. Help me out.
Every
Beyond the
single-
Pew,
Yeah.
we ask a question
Yeah.
What is it?
to
Yeah.
our listeners.
We have
to
only had
engage and
2
challenge
good
them.
answers so
Absolutely.
far.
Do you know what that question is?
I believe I do. Yeah.
What is that question, Miles?
What does your life look like beyond the pew?
Indeed.
Wow.
What
Yeah.
does your life look like beyond the pew?
May
And
be glorifying.
to the Lord Jesus, always.
Always.
To the
Always.
Lord
Always.
Jesus. We hope you
Yeah.
come
Yeah.
back next week. Miles, thanks for being
Thank
here.
you very
this
much
week,
for
man.
coming in.
bet.
Appreciate it. We'll see y'all next week.
ya. Share it.